I knew something was wrong the moment I saw that envelope from the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association sitting in my mailbox on that frigid February morning in Burlington, Vermont. The thin paper felt like it carried the weight of a legal notice, which, as it turned out, was exactly what it was. My name is Isaac Zimmerman, and I have lived in this moderately upscale neighborhood for 3 years now. The house is a beautiful colonial with white siding and blue shutters, exactly what my wife and I had dreamed of when we moved here from Boston. Vermont winters were brutal, sure, but we loved the community feel and the mountains in the distance. At least, we loved it until the new HOA board took over last year. Standing in my driveway, still in my work boots and heavy parka, I tore open the envelope. The temperature was a brutal 12 degrees, and my breath came out in white puffs as I read the notice. My hands started shaking, and it was not from the cold. Notice of violation, it read in bold letters at the top. Dear Mr. Zimmerman, it has come to our attention that you are in direct violation of Pinewood Estates, HOA Covenant Section 7.3.2. which states that snow removal from driveways and walkways must be completed within 24 hours of snowfall cessation, and that accumulated snow piles may not exceed 4 feet in height from ground level. Your current snow pile, measured on February 10, 2026, stands at 5 feet and 3 inches. You have 48 hours to remedy this situation or face a fine of $250 per day until compliance is achieved. Sincerely, Brenda Morrison, HOA President. I stood there, staring at the paper like it was written in a foreign language. 5 feet and 3 inches. The snowstorm had ended just yesterday afternoon, and I had been out here with my snowblower for 2 hours, clearing everything. Sure, I had piled the snow at the edge of my driveway like every other homeowner on the block, but 5 feet. That seemed impossible. I walked over to the snow pile in question, the one that sat at the far right corner of my driveway near the street. It was substantial, I would give them that. We had gotten nearly 2 feet of snow in the last storm, and it had landed on top of what was already there from previous weeks. But still, I had not thought it was that tall. I went inside and grabbed my tape measure from the garage, then came back out to check. From the ground to the top of the pile, it measured exactly 5 feet and 4 inches. My stomach dropped. They were right, or at least technically right. But here was the thing that really got me. I looked down the street at my neighbors' houses. The Hendersons had a snow pile that looked even taller than mine. The Kowalskis across the street had mounded their snow into what looked like a small hill. Even the Patels 3 houses down had impressive snow accumulations. Why was I being singled out? I went inside, my face burning despite the cold. My wife looked up from her laptop at the kitchen table. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately, reading my expression. "The HOA," I said, tossing the notice on the table. "They are fining me for my snow pile being too tall." She picked up the paper and read it, her eyebrows rising with each line. "Are you kidding me? They actually measured your snow pile, apparently, and I am going to get fined $250 a day starting in 48 hours if I do not fix it. Where are you supposed to put it?" She asked, gesturing toward the window. "It is not like we can make it disappear." That was the real problem. In Vermont winters, you accumulated snow. There was nowhere for it to go except where you piled it. You could not dump it in the street, that was illegal. You could not throw it on your neighbor's property. You just had to stack it and wait for spring. I spent that evening fuming, pacing around the house, unable to focus on anything else. The more I thought about it, the more unfair it seemed. I had done nothing wrong. I had cleared my driveway promptly. I had followed all the reasonable rules, and now I was being punished for something completely beyond my control. That night, lying in bed, an idea started forming in my mind. If they wanted to play by the exact letter of the rules, then maybe I should check if they were following those same rules. Specifically, I wondered about Brenda Morrison herself. She lived just 4 houses down from me, in a larger colonial with a circular driveway. I had seen her snow piles. In fact, I distinctly remembered thinking last week that her piles looked enormous. The next morning, Saturday, I woke up early. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a pink glow over the snow-covered neighborhood. I grabbed my tape measure, put on my warmest clothes, and headed out with a purpose. If I was going to fight this, I needed evidence. I started with my immediate neighbors, walking casually down the street like I was just out for a morning stroll. At the Henderson house, I pretended to tie my shoe while I eyeballed their snow pile. It was definitely tall. When no one was looking, I quickly measured it, 6 feet even. I took a photo with my phone, making sure to capture the tape measure in the frame and the house number visible in the background. At the Kowalski house, their pile measured 5 feet and 8 inches. Another photo for my collection. Then I headed toward Brenda Morrison's house. She had a corner lot, which meant she had even more driveway to clear and, consequently, more snow to pile. I could see from half a block away that her snow piles were substantial. There were actually 2 of them, one on each side of her circular driveway. I approached carefully, keeping an eye on her windows for any sign of movement. It was only 7 in the morning on a Saturday, so I hoped she was still asleep. The first pile on the left side of her driveway measured an impressive 6 feet and 4 inches. The second pile on the right was even taller at 6 feet and 7 inches. I took multiple photos of each pile, making sure to get clear shots of the measurements, the piles themselves, and enough of her house to prove the location. My heart was pounding. This was it. The HOA president, the person who had issued my violation notice, was herself in violation of the exact same rule, and by a much larger margin. I walked back home, my mind racing with possibilities. When I got inside, I immediately sat down at my computer and pulled up the HOA's official complaint form from their website. I filled it out meticulously, attaching the photos of Brenda's snow piles and noting the exact measurements and the date and time they were taken. In the description section, I wrote, "I am formally reporting a violation of Pinewood Estates HOA Covenant Section 7.3.2. The property at 847 Maple Drive has 2 snow piles measuring 6 feet 4 inches and 6 feet 7 inches respectively, both exceeding the 4-foot maximum by a significant margin. These measurements were taken on February 11, 2026, at approximately 7:15 a.m. I request that the same enforcement action be taken as outlined in my own violation notice received February 10, 2026. I hit submit and sat back in my chair, a mix of satisfaction and anxiety washing over me. Part of me felt petty for doing this, but a larger part felt justified. If they were going to enforce these ridiculous rules, they needed to enforce them fairly and consistently. I did not stop there. Over the next few hours, I documented every single snow pile in our neighborhood that exceeded 4 feet. Out of the 32 houses on our street, 21 had violations. I submitted formal complaints for each one, with photos and measurements. It was tedious work, but I was motivated by a sense of righteous indignation. By Monday morning, I still had not heard anything back from the HOA. My 48-hour deadline to fix my own violation was rapidly approaching. I had actually spent Sunday afternoon moving some of my snow pile, spreading it out across my backyard to lower its height. It was exhausting work and my back ached, but I managed to get it down to 3 feet and 10 inches, just under the limit. Then, Monday afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I did not recognize, but the area code was local. "Hello," I answered. "Mr. Zimmerman, this is Brenda Morrison from the Pinewood Estates HOA." Her voice was clipped and cold. "I received your complaint form regarding my property." "Oh, good," I said, keeping my tone neutral. I wanted to make sure the HOA was aware of all violations in the neighborhood, not just mine. There was a pause. "Mr. Zimmerman, I think you misunderstand the nature of HOA enforcement. We receive complaints from residents and we investigate them. Your property was reported to us by a concerned neighbor. Then you will be investigating your own property as well," I asked, "because my measurements were very clear. Your snow piles are well over the limit." Another pause, longer this time. "The situation at my property is different. I have a corner lot, which means more driveway space and therefore more snow accumulation. It is not a fair comparison. The covenant does not mention anything about exceptions for corner lots," I said, pulling up the HOA documents on my computer screen. "Section 7.3.2 applies to all properties equally. That is what you told me in my violation notice." "Mr. Zimmerman," Brenda said, and I could hear the edge creeping into her voice, "I do not appreciate your tone. As HOA president, I have some discretion in how rules are enforced." "Discretion?" I repeated. "So you can choose to enforce rules against some people but not others. That does not sound legal. In fact, that sounds like selective enforcement, which could be considered harassment." "Are you threatening me?" she snapped. "Not at all," I said calmly, though my heart was racing. "I am simply pointing out that if you are going to fine me $250 a day for a 5-foot snow pile, then consistency would dictate that you should face consequences for your 6.5-foot piles. Unless, of course, you would like to waive my fine and acknowledge that the 4-foot rule is unrealistic given our Vermont winters." Silence on the other end. I could practically hear her fuming. "I will be bringing this matter to the HOA board," she finally said. "We will be in touch." She hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there holding my phone, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I had just gone head-to-head with the HOA president, and I had no idea what would happen next. Part of me felt triumphant, but another part worried that I had just made things much worse for myself. That evening, I got an email from the HOA. It was not from Brenda this time, but from the vice president, a man named Gerald Foster. The email was formal and brief. "Dear Mr. Zimmerman, in light of recent complaints and discussions, the HOA board will be holding an emergency meeting on February 15, 2026, at 7:00 p.m. in the community center to discuss snow removal policies and enforcement. Your attendance is requested." The meeting was 4 days away. I had a feeling it was going to be interesting. Over the next few days, word spread through the neighborhood about what was happening. Several of my neighbors stopped by or called to tell me they had also received violation notices about their snow piles. The Hendersons got one. So did the Kowalskis, the Patels, and about 15 other families on our street. It seemed that after my mass complaint filing, the HOA had decided to go on an enforcement spree. But here was the interesting part. Not everyone who had a violation got a notice. Some houses with clearly over-height snow piles received nothing. As I talked to more neighbors, a pattern started to emerge. The people who had not received notices were all friends with Brenda Morrison or other board members. The ones who got notices were either neutral parties or people who had previously complained about HOA decisions. This was bigger than just snow piles. This was about power and control. By the time Thursday evening rolled around, the community center was packed. I arrived 15 minutes early and still barely found a seat. The room was buzzing with angry conversations. I recognized most of the faces as my neighbors, many of them holding their own violation notices. The HOA board sat at a table at the front of the room. Brenda Morrison in the center, Gerald Foster to her right, and 3 other board members I recognized but did not know well. Brenda had short blonde hair styled in that particular way that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager." She was probably in her early 50s, dressed in a blazer that seemed too formal for a neighborhood HOA meeting. At 7 o'clock sharp, Brenda banged a gavel on the table. "This meeting will come to order. We are here tonight to address concerns about snow removal policy enforcement in Pinewood Estates." "You mean to address why you are selectively enforcing rules?" someone shouted from the back. Brenda's face tightened. "Please hold your comments until the public comment period." As I was saying, we have received an unusual number of complaints recently about snow pile heights. The board takes these complaints seriously, as they represent violations of our covenants. "Even when you are the one violating them," I called out, unable to help myself. Brenda's eyes locked onto mine across the room. "Mr. Zimmerman, you will have your turn to speak." "I would like to speak now, actually," I said, standing up, "since this whole meeting seems to be a response to the complaints I filed." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Brenda looked like she wanted to object, but Gerald leaned over and whispered something to her. She nodded tersely. "Fine. Mr. Zimmerman, you have 3 minutes." I walked to the front of the room, pulling out my phone. "Thank you. As many of you know, I received a violation notice last week for having a snow pile that measured 5 feet and 3 inches, which exceeds our 4-foot maximum by 15 inches. The notice came with a threat of $250 daily fines. What you might not know is that I then went around our neighborhood and measured everyone else's snow piles. I pulled up the photos on my phone. Brenda Morrison, our HOA president, has 2 snow piles that measure 6 feet 4 inches and 6 feet 7 inches. That is more than 2 feet over the limit. Yet when I reported this violation, I was told that her situation was different because she has a corner lot. People started talking all at once. Brenda banged her gavel again. "That is not exactly what I said." "Then what did you mean?" I challenged. "Because from where I am standing, it looks like the rules apply to everyone except you and your friends." I showed more photos on my phone, walking people through my findings. Out of 32 houses on our street, 21 had snow piles over 4 feet. But only 17 received violation notices. The 4 that did not receive notices, all board members or their immediate neighbors who serve on HOA committees. The room erupted. People were standing, shouting questions, waving their own violation notices in the air. Brenda banged the gavel repeatedly, but the noise did not die down. Finally, Gerald stood up. "Everyone, please, let us maintain order." His voice was deep and commanding, and people gradually quieted. "Mr. Zimmerman, these are serious accusations. Do you have proof of this selective enforcement?" "I have photos, measurements, timestamps, and a list of who received notices versus who did not," I said. "I would be happy to share all of it with the board and anyone else who wants to see it." "This is ridiculous," Brenda interjected. "We base our enforcement on complaints received. If someone is not reported, we do not go looking for violations." "But I did report violations," I said. "I reported yours specifically with photos and measurements, yet you received no notice. Why is that?" Brenda's face was turning red. "Because as board president, I have the authority to determine which complaints warrant action. So you can report me but ignore reports against yourself," I pressed. "How is that not a conflict of interest? A woman I recognized as Helen Kowalski stood up. My husband and I got a notice for a snow pile that is 6 inches over the limit. We have lived here for 12 years and never had a problem before. This is harassment. Others joined in, sharing their own stories. The meeting devolved into chaos for several minutes before Gerald finally restored some semblance of order. "I think it is clear that we need to revisit our snow removal policy," he said, shooting a look at Brenda. "The 4-foot limit may not be realistic for Vermont winters, especially after heavy snowfall." "The limit is in our covenants," Brenda insisted. "We cannot just ignore it. We can amend it," someone called out. "Amendments require a vote of all homeowners," Brenda said. "That takes time." "Then in the meantime, we should suspend enforcement," I suggested. "Calling a moratorium until we can have a proper vote on whether to change the rule." People applauded. Brenda looked furious, but she was outnumbered. Even the other board members seemed to recognize that continuing down this path would only cause more problems. "Fine," Brenda said through gritted teeth. "We will table enforcement actions pending a review of the snow removal policy. But this does not mean the rules do not exist. They are still in our covenants, and we all agreed to them when we bought our homes. Some of us agreed to them under the assumption they would be enforced fairly," I countered. "That clearly has not been happening." The meeting continued for another hour, with various residents voicing their complaints about HOA overreach. It became clear that the snow pile issue was just the tip of the iceberg. People were upset about fines for lawn decorations, parking restrictions, and exterior paint color approvals that took months. The HOA had become increasingly authoritarian, and people were fed up. By the time the meeting ended at 9:30, a group of residents had formed what we called the Pinewood Fairness Committee, dedicated to reforming the HOA and ensuring transparent, consistent rule enforcement. I found myself volunteered as the co-chair, along with Helen Kowalski. As people filed out, Brenda approached me. Her expression was ice cold. "You think you are very clever, do not you?" she said quietly. "I think I am someone who wants to be treated fairly," I replied. "That is all I have ever wanted." "You have made an enemy today, Mr. Zimmerman," she said. "I would be very careful if I were you." "Is that a threat?" I asked, my voice hardening. "It is a fact," she said, then turned and walked away. I stood there watching her leave, an uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. I had won this battle, but I had a sense that the war was just beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, things seemed to calm down. The promised review of the snow removal policy was underway, with several residents serving on a special committee to draft proposed amendments. The Pinewood Fairness Committee had its first official meeting, and nearly 40 homeowners attended. We discussed various HOA issues and started compiling a list of grievances to present to the board. But then, in early March, I received another notice from the HOA. This one was about my fence. I did not even have a fence. The notice stated that I had erected a fence along my property line without prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee, in violation of Section 4.7 of the Covenants. It included a grainy photo that supposedly showed my property. The fine was $500, with an additional $100 per day until the fence was removed. I stared at the notice in disbelief. This was insane. I immediately called Gerald Foster, who I had come to see as more reasonable than Brenda. "Gerald, I just got a notice about a fence that does not exist," I said when he answered. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean there is no fence on my property. None. Zero. This notice is completely fabricated." There was a pause. "Let me look into this." "Can you send me a photo of your property showing there is no fence?" "Of course," I said. But Gerald, this is obviously retaliation for what happened at the meeting. Brenda is making things up to fine me. I will look into it, he repeated, but his tone suggested he was thinking the same thing. I sent him multiple photos of my property from every angle, clearly showing the absence of any fence. An hour later, he called me back. Isaac, I am very sorry about this. The photo in the violation notice is actually of the Hendricks property on Birch Lane, not yours. It was a clerical error. A clerical error, I repeated skeptically. Gerald, come on. My address is on the notice. My name is on the notice. Someone had to deliberately put the wrong photo with my information. I agree it is concerning, he said. I am going to void this violation immediately, and I am going to have a conversation with Brenda about quality control in our enforcement process. Quality control, I felt my anger rising. This is harassment, Gerald. She is targeting me. I understand your frustration, he said carefully. But I need you to trust that I am going to handle this appropriately. I wanted to argue more, but I could tell I was not going to get anywhere. Fine, but I am documenting all of this. If another fake violation shows up, I am going to a lawyer. That is your right, he said. Again, I apologize for the confusion. After I hung up, I immediately called Helen Kowalski to tell her what had happened. She was outraged. We need to escalate this, she said. This is beyond petty HOA politics. She is abusing her position. I agree, but what can we do? I asked. We can call for her removal, Helen said. The bylaws allow for a vote of no confidence if we get signatures from 30% of homeowners. That would trigger a special election for her position. That was an interesting idea. How many signatures would we need? There are 212 homes in Pinewood Estates, she said. So we would need signatures from at least 64 homeowners. I think we could get that, especially after what happened at the meeting. Let us do it, I said. I will start drafting a petition. Over the next 3 weeks, Helen and I went door to door collecting signatures. The response was overwhelming. People were tired of Brenda's heavy-handed tactics. Many shared their own stories of ridiculous fines and selective enforcement. One couple had been fined because their mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Another family got dinged because their lawn mower was briefly visible from the street while they were using it, which apparently violated the no equipment storage rule, even though they were actively mowing at the time. By the end of March, we had collected 93 signatures, well over the required threshold. We submitted our petition to the HOA board, formally requesting a vote of no confidence in Brenda Morrison's leadership. The board was required to schedule a vote within 30 days. They set it for April 25th. Brenda, predictably, did not take this well. She sent out a mass email to all homeowners, claiming that the petition was the result of a small group of malcontents who wanted to undermine the HOA's ability to maintain property values. She accused Helen and me by name of organizing a campaign of harassment against her. This backfired spectacularly. Several homeowners who had not signed the petition reached out to add their names. The email made Brenda look petty and vindictive, exactly the image we had been painting of her leadership. In the weeks leading up to the vote, the neighborhood was tense. There were definitely people who supported Brenda, mostly older residents who valued strict rule enforcement and saw the HOA as a bulwark against declining property values. But the majority seemed to be on our side, wanting more reasonable and fair governance. Then, a week before the vote, something happened that changed everything. I was working from home on a Tuesday afternoon when there was a loud knock at my door. I opened it to find 2 police officers standing on my porch. Isaac Zimmerman, one of them asked. My heart dropped. Yes, that is me. What is this about? "We need to ask you some questions about harassment allegations," the officer said. "May we come in?" I let them in, my mind reeling. Harassment allegations. Once we were seated in my living room, the officers explained that Brenda Morrison had filed a police report claiming that I had been harassing her. She alleged that I had been following her, taking photos of her property without permission, and making threatening phone calls. "That is completely false," I said immediately. "I took photos of snow piles visible from the public street, which is completely legal. I have never followed her, and I have definitely never made threatening calls." "You have phone records that could verify that?" one officer asked. "Of course," I said, pulling out my phone. I showed them my call log, which showed no calls to Brenda's number except for one brief incoming call from her after I had filed my initial complaint. The officers took notes and asked more questions about my interactions with Brenda. I explained the entire situation, from the original snow pile violation to the fake fence notice to the petition campaign. I showed them all my documentation, including emails and photos. "This sounds like a civil dispute," one officer finally said. "There is nothing here that suggests criminal harassment. Taking photos of snow piles from a public street is protected activity. Filing HOA complaints through official channels is not harassment, and your phone records support your statement that you have not been making unwanted calls." "So what happens now?" I asked. "We will file our report," the officer said. "Miss Morrison has the right to file a complaint, but based on what you have shown us, we do not see evidence of criminal conduct. This appears to be an HOA dispute that should be resolved through civil channels." After the officers left, I immediately called my own lawyer. I had been consulting with an attorney named Richard Paulson about potential legal action against the HOA, and this latest development seemed like it had crossed a line. "She filed a false police report to intimidate you before the vote," Richard said after I explained what had happened. "That could actually be criminal conduct on her part, depending on what she told the police." "Can we do anything about it?" I asked. "We can file a complaint with the police if she knowingly made false statements," he said. "And we can certainly use this as evidence in a civil suit if you decide to go that route. Filing false police reports to harass someone engaged in protected HOA activities could constitute abuse of process." "Let me get through this vote first," I said. "Then we can talk about next steps." The attempted police harassment actually helped our cause. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about what Brenda had done, and it disgusted people. Even some of her supporters started to distance themselves. Using the police to settle an HOA dispute was seen as a bridge too far. On the evening of April 25th, the community center was once again packed for the vote of no confidence. The tension in the room was palpable. Brenda sat at the board table looking defiant, her jaw set, her eyes hard. Gerald Foster, as vice president, chaired the meeting. He explained the voting procedure. All homeowners in good standing could vote, one vote per household. The vote would be by secret ballot. A simple majority was required to remove Brenda from her position. Before the vote, both sides were allowed to make brief statements. Helen spoke first, outlining the pattern of selective enforcement, abuse of power, and retaliation that had characterized Brenda's tenure. She was calm, factual, and compelling. Then Brenda gave her statement. She talked about the importance of maintaining standards, protecting property values, and not letting the HOA become toothless. She portrayed herself as the only thing standing between order and chaos in the neighborhood. But her tone was defensive, and she could not resist taking shots at Helen and me, calling us troublemakers who had personal vendettas. The voting took about 30 minutes as people filled out their ballots and dropped them in the box. Then came the count. Gerald and 2 other neutral board members tallied the votes while we all waited. Finally, Gerald stood up. The results of the vote are as follows: 138 votes in favor of removing Brenda Morrison from the position of HOA president, 74 votes against. The motion passes. The room erupted in applause. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Brenda stood up abruptly, her face red, and stormed out of the meeting without a word. In the aftermath, Gerald Foster became acting president. One of his first acts was to suspend all pending violation fines pending review. He also announced the formation of a new oversight committee to review the HOA's enforcement practices and ensure fairness and transparency. I thought that was the end of it. I really did. Brenda had been removed from power, reforms were underway, and things seemed to be heading in a positive direction. But I had underestimated just how vindictive Brenda could be. 2 weeks after the vote, I came home from work to find my mailbox had been smashed. Not just knocked over, but completely destroyed, the post broken and the box itself dented beyond repair. I filed a police report, but there was no evidence of who had done it. 3 days later, someone slashed 2 of my tires overnight. Again, no witnesses. No cameras pointed that direction. No evidence. Then, a week after that, I received a letter from a lawyer representing Brenda Morrison. It was a cease and desist letter, demanding that I stop defaming her and threatening a lawsuit for damages to her reputation. The letter claimed that my false allegations about her conduct had caused her emotional distress and harmed her standing in the community. This was when I decided enough was enough. I called Richard Paulson again. "She is escalating," I told him. "I think she is behind the vandalism, and now she is threatening to sue me for speaking the truth." "You have any proof she is behind the vandalism?" Richard asked. "No direct proof," I admitted, "but the timing is pretty suspicious. It all started happening after she was removed from the board." "That is something we can work with," Richard said. "Let me send a letter to her attorney. We will make it very clear that you were engaged in protected activity by petitioning for her removal, and that any lawsuit against you would be frivolous and potentially subject to anti-SLAPP statutes." SLAPP stood for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. It was designed to protect people from being sued for exercising their free speech rights. Vermont had a decent anti-SLAPP law that could apply here. Richard sent the letter, and we waited. Meanwhile, I installed security cameras around my house. If Brenda or anyone else was going to mess with my property, I wanted evidence. For about 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then, one night in late May, my cameras caught something interesting. It was 2:15 in the morning when motion was detected in my driveway. I got an alert on my phone, but was too asleep to check it immediately. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, I saw a figure in dark clothing approaching my car. The person tried the door handle, found it locked, and then walked around the vehicle. The video was grainy due to the low light, but the figure's build and movements seemed female. Then the figure did something stupid. She pulled out her phone, and the screen briefly illuminated her face. It was Brenda Morrison. I could not believe what I was seeing. She had actually come to my property in the middle of the night. She did not end up doing any damage because I had locked my car in my garage, but the intent was clearly there. I immediately saved the footage and called the police. This time, I had evidence. The officer who responded watched the video several times. "That is definitely trespassing," he said. "And given the prior incidents of vandalism, we could potentially establish a pattern of harassment. We will need to investigate further." Over the next few days, the police did their investigation. They pulled records from my previous vandalism reports and interviewed neighbors. It turned out that one of my neighbors, an elderly man named Robert who lived across the street and often had trouble sleeping, had noticed a car matching the description of Brenda's SUV parked on our street on the nights of both the mailbox destruction and the tire slashing. He had not thought much of it at the time, but when the police asked, he remembered. With this additional information, the police had enough to bring charges. On June 3rd, Brenda Morrison was arrested for trespassing, vandalism, and harassment. The arrest sent shockwaves through Pinewood Estates. Even people who had supported Brenda were appalled. The story made the local news, complete with my security camera footage blurred just enough to protect privacy, but clear enough to show what had happened. Brenda's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor's office was not particularly sympathetic. The evidence was clear, and this was not a one-time lapse in judgment, but a pattern of behavior designed to intimidate and harass someone for engaging in lawful HOA activities. The case went to court in September. I had to testify about the timeline of events, from the original snow pile violation to the vote of no confidence to the vandalism incidents. The prosecutor painted a clear picture of escalating retaliation, and the jury agreed. Brenda was convicted of 2 counts of vandalism, 1 count of criminal trespassing, and 1 count of harassment. The judge sentenced her to 6 months in jail, suspended pending completion of 1 year of probation, 200 hours of community service, and restitution for the damage to my property. She was also ordered to stay away from me and my family. In addition to the criminal case, I filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages for the harassment, emotional distress, and legal fees. That case settled out of court for $15,000, which mostly went to covering my attorney fees, but the principle of the thing mattered more to me than the money. By the time fall arrived, life in Pinewood Estates had returned to something resembling normal. Gerald Foster remained as HOA president and proved to be reasonable and fair. The snow removal policy was amended to increase the maximum pile height to 7 feet, with exceptions allowed for unusual weather events. An independent review committee was established to hear appeals of any violation notices, ensuring that no single person had unchecked power. The Pinewood Fairness Committee, having achieved its main goals, transitioned into a less formal neighborhood association focused on community building rather than fighting the HOA. Helen and I remained friends and occasional co-conspirators when HOA issues arose, but mostly we just got together for barbecues and complained about Vermont winters over beer. As for Brenda, she ended up selling her house and moving away. I heard through the grapevine that she relocated somewhere in Florida, perhaps hoping for a fresh start in a place with less snow and, presumably, fewer people willing to measure her snow piles. Looking back on the whole experience, it was exhausting and frustrating, but also strangely empowering. I had stood up to someone abusing their power, and I had won, not just for myself, but for my entire community. The HOA, which had become an instrument of control and petty tyranny, had been reformed into something more democratic and fair. I learned a lot through the process. I learned that documentation is everything. Every photo I took, every email I saved, every measurement I recorded, it all mattered when it came time to prove my case. I learned that standing up to bullies is hard and sometimes dangerous, but necessary. I learned that most people, when given the choice, will choose fairness over authoritarianism. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that community matters. When I first filed those complaints about the snow piles, I felt alone, like it was me against the HOA. But as the situation developed, I discovered that I was not alone at all. There were dozens of other families who felt the same frustration, who were tired of being pushed around, who wanted something better. Together, we were able to create real change. The irony of the whole situation was not lost on me. It all started because my snow pile was 15 inches too tall. 15 inches. That tiny measurement led to months of conflict, a vote of no confidence, criminal charges, and ultimately a complete reform of how our HOA operated. All because someone decided to enforce a petty rule in a selective and unfair way. There were certainly moments when I regretted getting involved. The stress, the legal fees, the vandalism, the feeling of being targeted, none of that was pleasant. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I should just pay the fine and move on, if fighting was really worth it. But every time I had those thoughts, I came back to the same conclusion. Some things are worth fighting for. Fairness is worth fighting for. Justice is worth fighting for. The right to be treated with dignity and respect in your own community is worth fighting for. My wife and I still live in Pinewood Estates. We have no plans to move. This is our home, and we helped make it better. Every time it snows now, and I am out there with my snowblower piling snow at the edge of my driveway, I think about how far we have come. I can pile my snow 7 feet high if I need to, and nobody is going to fine me for it. More importantly, everyone else in the neighborhood has that same freedom. Last winter, we got another massive snowstorm, nearly 3 feet in one day. The next morning, I was out clearing my driveway when I noticed something amusing. Several of my neighbors had built their snow piles deliberately tall, way taller than necessary, some probably close to 8 or 9 feet. They were almost like snow monuments, proud declarations of freedom from arbitrary rules. I laughed when I saw them. It was a middle finger to the old way of doing things, a celebration of our collective victory over petty tyranny. I was tempted to build my own pile extra tall just to join in the joke, but honestly, I was tired of dealing with snow. 7 feet was more than enough for me. Gerald came by while I was finishing up my driveway. He lived a few houses down and was also out dealing with the snow. "Quite a storm," he called out. "Yeah, a big one," I agreed. "You remember when we used to get fined for piles this size?" he laughed. "That seems like a lifetime ago. Crazy how things can change." "For the better," I said. "Definitely for the better," he agreed. We chatted for a few more minutes about nothing in particular. Just neighbor talk about weather and work, and whether the Patriots would be any good next season. It was normal, comfortable, the kind of interaction that makes a neighborhood feel like a community rather than just a collection of houses. As he walked back to his own driveway, I took a moment to appreciate where we were. The fights, the stress, the conflict, it had all been worth it to get to this point. A point where the HOA served the community rather than controlling it, where rules were enforced fairly and reasonably, where neighbors looked out for each other instead of reporting each other for minor infractions. I finished clearing my driveway and went inside, grateful for the warmth and for the peace of mind that came from knowing I was not going to find a violation notice in my mailbox the next day. My wife had hot chocolate waiting, and we sat together at the kitchen table, watching the snow continue to fall outside. "Do you ever think about how all this started?" she asked. "With just a snow pile, all the time," I said. "It is funny how small things can snowball." I paused. "No pun intended," she laughed. "I am proud of you, for standing up when it would have been easier to just go along." "I am proud of us," I corrected. "You supported me through all of it, even when things got scary with the vandalism and everything." "That is what marriage is about," she said simply. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our hot chocolate and watching the winter scene outside. The neighborhood looked peaceful under its blanket of white, the kind of picture-perfect New England scene that had drawn us here in the first place. Later that evening, I got a call from Helen. She and her husband had organized a neighborhood potluck for the following weekend, a sort of winter celebration to bring everyone together. With everything that had happened over the past year, there had been divisions and tensions in the community. The potluck was meant to help heal those and remind everyone that we were all neighbors, regardless of which side of the HOA disputes we had been on. "We are calling it the Snow Day Social," Helen said with a laugh. "2 on the nose. It is perfect," I said. "Count us in. What should we bring?" The party was a success. Nearly 100 people showed up, filling the community center with warmth and laughter and far too much food. Even some of the people who had supported Brenda came, and while there was some initial awkwardness, everyone was civil and even friendly once we got talking. One woman who had voted against removing Brenda approached me during the party. Her name was Margaret, and she lived on the other side of the neighborhood. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I thought you were just stirring up trouble for no reason. I did not understand how bad things had gotten." "No apology necessary," I said. "You voted your conscience based on what you knew at the time. That is all anyone can do." "Still," she insisted, "you were right and I was wrong. The way Brenda went after you, especially after she lost the vote, that showed her true character. I am sorry I did not see it sooner." We talked for a while longer, and I realized that this was what healing looked like. Not everyone shouting about how right they were, but people listening to each other, acknowledging mistakes, and moving forward together. As the party wound down and people started heading home, Gerald pulled me aside. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for everything you did. I know it cost you a lot, time, money, stress, but you made this place better." "We made it better," I said. "It was not just me. It was you, Helen, all the people who signed the petition, everyone who showed up to vote." "True," he acknowledged, "but you were the catalyst. You were the one who said enough is enough. That takes courage." I did not know how to respond to that, so I just nodded. We shook hands and he headed home with his family. Driving home that night with my wife, I felt a sense of completeness that had been missing for a long time. The fight was over. We had won. And more importantly, we had built something better in the process. The legal aftermath continued for a few more months. Brenda's probation proceeded without incident as far as I knew. My civil case settled in November, right before Thanksgiving. The insurance company that covered the HOA's liability ended up paying most of it, which seemed appropriate since Brenda's actions had been taken in her capacity as HOA president, even if they were not authorized. Richard, my lawyer, sent me a final bill along with a letter. "It was a pleasure working with you," he wrote. "Cases like this remind me why I became a lawyer. Sometimes the system actually works and justice is served. You should be proud of what you accomplished." I was proud, though it felt strange to think of myself as someone who had accomplished something significant. I had just been trying to defend myself against an unfair fine. Everything that followed had been a chain reaction, one thing leading to another, but maybe that is how most change happens. Not through grand gestures or elaborate plans, but through ordinary people saying no to injustice in their own lives and being willing to follow through on that no, even when it is hard. As 2026 drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the year. It had started with that violation notice in February, and had spiraled into something I never could have predicted. A year ago, if someone had told me I would end up in multiple court cases, leading a reform movement and getting my former HOA president arrested, I would have thought they were insane. But life is unpredictable. You do not get to choose your battles most of the time. They choose you. All you can control is how you respond. I chose to respond by standing up, by documenting everything, by building coalitions with my neighbors, by refusing to be intimidated. And it worked out, though there were plenty of moments when it could have gone the other way. The holidays that year were particularly sweet. We hosted Christmas dinner at our house, inviting several of the neighbors we had grown close to during the HOA battles. Helen and her family came, as did Gerald and his wife, and a few others. It was loud and chaotic and wonderful, exactly what the season should be. At one point during dinner, someone made a joke about snow piles, and the whole table laughed. It had become a running gag in the neighborhood, our shared experience that bonded us together. The Great Snow Pile War of 2026, someone had dubbed it. The name stuck. As winter turned to spring, the snow finally melted, taking with it the physical reminder of where everything had started. But the changes we had made to the HOA remained. The new policies, the oversight committee, the culture of fairness and transparency, all of it endured. Life settled into a new normal. The HOA still sent out occasional violation notices, but they were reasonable and consistently enforced. If someone let their lawn grow too wild or left trash cans out for days, they might get a friendly reminder. But gone were the days of measuring snow piles with a tape measure and threatening huge fines for minor infractions. I went back to focusing on work and family, the normal rhythms of life. The HOA drama became a story I told at parties, something interesting that had happened but was now safely in the past. Though I remained engaged with neighborhood issues, I was happy to let Gerald and others handle the day-to-day governance. Every now and then, I would drive past Brenda's old house, now owned by a young couple with 2 small kids. They seemed nice, and they had no idea about the history attached to that address. It was probably better that way. The house deserved a fresh start, free from the baggage of its former owner. I never heard from Brenda again after she moved away. Part of me wondered if she had learned anything from the experience, if she had reflected on her actions and changed, but I suspected not. Some people are so convinced of their own righteousness that they cannot see when they have crossed the line from enforcing rules to abusing power. That was her loss, not mine. I had moved on. One afternoon in late spring, I was working in my front yard, planting some new shrubs when a car pulled up. A couple got out, looking at houses in the neighborhood with that particular expression of people house hunting. They approached me. "Excuse me, do you live here?" the woman asked. "I do," I said, standing up and brushing dirt off my hands. "We are looking at houses in this area," she explained. "What is it like living here? How is the HOA?" I smiled. "The HOA is actually pretty good now. They are fair, reasonable, and they listen to residents." It was not always that way, but we worked through some issues and made improvements. "That is good to hear," the man said. "We have heard horror stories about HOAs, so we are being careful." "Smart," I said. "My advice is to always read the covenants carefully before you buy, and pay attention to who is running the board. Good leadership makes all the difference." We chatted for a few more minutes, and I found myself feeling protective of the neighborhood in a way I had not before. This was our community, and we had fought to make it better. I wanted new people coming in to appreciate that and to help maintain it. After they left, I went back to my planting, thinking about how much had changed in just over a year. I had gone from being a somewhat disconnected resident who just wanted to be left alone to being actively invested in the community's well-being. The fight with Brenda had forced me to engage, to care, to recognize that my home was not just a building but part of a larger social fabric. That engagement had enriched my life in ways I had not expected. I knew my neighbors now, really knew them. We looked out for each other. When the Hendersons went on vacation, I collected their mail. When we needed a babysitter, we could call Helen. When anyone needed help with a project, there were always people willing to lend a hand. That sense of community was worth more than any property value or perfectly maintained aesthetic. It was what made a neighborhood a home. As I finished planting and stood back to admire my work, I felt genuinely content. The shrubs would grow and fill in over time, becoming part of the landscape. Similarly, the changes we had made to our community would take root and flourish, shaping the neighborhood for years to come. I had never set out to be an activist or a reformer. I had just wanted to clear my driveway after a snowstorm without being fined for where I put the snow. But sometimes, life pushes you into roles you never expected, and you discover strengths you did not know you had. Looking at my house, my yard, my street, I felt proud, not just of surviving the conflict, but of how we had all come together to create something better. That was the real victory, not defeating Brenda, but building a community based on respect and fairness. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I gathered my gardening tools and headed inside, ready for dinner and whatever came next. The great snow pile war was over, won decisively, and Pinewood Estates was better for it. As I walked through my front door, I took one last look back at the neighborhood. Kids were playing in the street, neighbors were chatting over fences, and everything felt peaceful and right. This was what we had fought for. This was why it had all been worth it. And next winter, when the snow fell again, I would be ready. Armed with my snowblower, my tape measure just in case, and the knowledge that I lived in a community that had my back. Whatever challenges came, we would face them together, as neighbors should. That was the real lesson of the whole experience. Not that HOAs are inherently bad or that fighting authority is always right, but that communities are strongest when they stand together for fairness and justice. When ordinary people refuse to accept injustice, even over something as seemingly trivial as a snow pile, they can create meaningful change. And that change ripples outward, affecting not just the immediate issue but the entire culture of a place. We had transformed Pinewood Estates from a neighborhood ruled by fear and arbitrary enforcement into one governed by reason and mutual respect. That was worth every bit of stress, every dollar spent on lawyers, every sleepless night wondering if I was doing the right thing. I was. We were. And our community was proof of that.